Good afternoon. This is Allison Pena with Worldwide ERC. Thank you to everyone for connecting and welcome to today's webinar program, Immigration Insights for Uncertain Times, Consular Challenges, Travel Bans, and the Visa Bulletin, sponsored by Barry Appelman and Leiden LLP. Before we begin, please take a moment to review Worldwide ERC's webinar disclaimer. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online at any time. To submit your question, please use the Q&A button located in the lower menu bar. Simply click on the button and type your question into the pop-up window when it comes up. All questions selected will be answered publicly. An email containing a link to the course evaluation and information on accessing the handout and recording of this session will go out tomorrow, 24 hours after the webinar start time. This webinar is worth 1 CRP and 1 GMS credit. If you are a GMS seeking CE credit for this webinar, you must include the name and date of this event on your GMS renewal application at the time you apply for recertification. The renewal application is available online. If you hold your CRP designation, credit will be added to your record internally within about 10 days. Attendees must be individually registered and logged in for the majority of the event to receive credit. The archived webinar session will be available to all for the next month and available to Worldwide ERC members for a second month. Please note this time will be reduced to 2 weeks and 1 month, respectively, for all webinars airing on or after January 1st, 2022. Our Premier Learning Platform subscribers can always view this session for 2 years after the initial airing. CRPs who log in and view the archived session will also receive continuing education credit automatically upon completion of the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Kelly Deaning is a partner in the San Francisco office of Barry Appelman and Leiden LLP and a member of the firm's Government Strategies team. Kelly joined BAL after a 17-year career with the Department of Justice Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. Kelly managed the Western Law Division of USCIS and was responsible for developing and coordinating all legal strategies in the Western United States. In addition to serving as a USCIS attorney, Kelly worked as an immigration officer in the Overseas Refugee Program in Nairobi, Kenya, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and various locations in Thailand. She was the acting field office director in Beijing, China, and New Delhi, India, and was an adjudications officer in Bangkok, Thailand. Tiffany Darrance is senior counsel in the Washington, D.C. office of Barry Appelman and Leiden LLP and a member of the firm's Government Strategies team. Tiffany joined BAL after 8 years with the U.S. State Department in the Bureau of Consular Affairs and as a senior advisor to the chief legal advisor for immigration affairs. In her roles at State, Tiffany has been at the forefront of legal issues impacting all facets of consular operations at U.S. embassies and consulates. She was a key advisor to senior leadership within the Visa Office, the Bureau of Consular Affairs, the White House, and other federal agencies on all aspects of immigration law, including implementation of presidential proclamations under 3 administrations. Maggie Murphy is a partner in the Austin office of Barry Appelman and Leiden LLP. She specializes in complex, creative business immigration solutions. With more than 20 years of technical experience in immigration law, she is an industry leader in PERM, I-9, and E-Verify compliance and business visa case types. Maggie is a nationally recognized leader in immigration law, currently serving as elected director on the Board of Governors for the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, as well as serving on several national committees for AILA. She is also a founding officer for the State Bar of Texas Immigration and Nationality Law Section and is board certified in Immigration and Nationality Law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. Maggie is a frequent speaker and author on various immigration topics. I'm happy to welcome Kelly, Tiffany, and Maggie to the program. I will now turn things over to Kelly. Oh, Kelly, you're on mute.
I always forget about that. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody, and welcome. And we're really happy to be here today to talk to you about these really important issues. Just real quickly for the agenda items today, We're going to be talking about the COVID-19 travel bans, just making sure you're all aware of the latest and greatest. And then I'll be turning it over to Tiffany, who will be chatting with you all more about insight into the Department of State operations, as well as the consular visa services. And then we'll move on to the outlook for the October visa bulletin and what you all can expect in terms of those visa numbers for the folks who are maybe eligible for lawful permanent resident status through your employment sponsorship. Because we've got a lot of information to share with you all today, I'm going to jump right on into it and get it turned over then to our experts, Maggie and Tiffany, so that you can get the down and dirty on everything that's going on. So I bring up this slide just to iterate how, I think under the Trump administration, we were all dealing with one storm after another for the most part. It seemed like every week there was a new major development coming through and sweeping across the landscape. And all of us, both, all companies were feeling the same thing. But I raised these travel highlights in that it almost feels like we're kind of in two weather systems that have collided, and we're kind of living in the middle of all of that. So, what I mean by that is, on the one hand, we have this healthcare and political dynamic going on with COVID and the variants right now that's forcing the Biden administration to slow international travel. And so we're, while we're all optimistic that both the circumstances and the appetite to open global travel was going to increase more quickly under the Biden administration, it's pretty clear now that they're settled in and they've not really changed as much as that we've all hoped that we would see in that global travel space. Now, that is now bumping up against a very strong US economy that's also, I believe, in front of sort of this global economy that's moving, right? It's, our economy right now is just ready to run. So companies and tourism and forces that drive that global travel are just pushing up against the Biden administration. And we're all experiencing sort of the intersection of those two forces coming together. And really, this is unlike any other pressure that we've seen before. And we like to highlight this chart to kind of show that difference. During all the various different crises that had happened, you can see how the international tourist arrival worldwide had been affected. But, we've never seen anything, at the very end where we have COVID, the significant drops in international travel that this graph describes. So what does it mean to you and your colleagues, and sort of what are you all feeling, right? So what it really means is you could have friends at one company who have their cases easily moving through the consulates, or they were easily able to get an emergency appointment with no problem. And then on the other hand, you might be a company that no matter what you've done, your CEO and president is being told, hey, we can't deal with it right now, wait 6 months and check back with us. So it's that differential treatment because of these two forces that are colliding together that we're starting to see. So what we'd like to do for you all today is sort of try to explain why that's all happening, and what's going on, what's causing these movements, and then how you all can navigate through all of that. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Tiffany, who's going to talk to us more about these travel restrictions, as well as consular operations and where things currently stand. So Tiffany, over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to start by talking about COVID and the current travel bans that are still in place. There are multiple travel restrictions that are still in place, many of which have been in place for quite a while now. If anybody has been physically present in any of the restricted countries in the last 14 days, then they are not permitted to travel to the United States unless they qualify for an exception. President Biden has not announced any plans to lift or modify these, and there's no expiration date on them. So as long as the COVID trend continues, we can expect that these will still remain in place. Some of the exceptions might be for a family relationship, but the big one that we're going to talk about is for temporary work travel. I think that foreign nationals who are coming temporarily to work in the United States, such as on an H-1B visa or an L visa, are most heavily impacted by these regional travel bans. And that is what we are seeing with opening up of businesses and travel and how it is impacting those companies. So to qualify for what is called a national interest exception for business personnel, the two main requirements are that the individual is providing vital support or executive direction for a critical infrastructure sector or significant economic activity in the United States. And because these national interest exception are needed, and this applies whether you have a valid visa now or whether you are seeking a visa or if you have ESTA, anybody who is present in the region. Because you have this new requirement on top of just having the valid visa and a passport to travel to the United States, we're seeing even more delays in consular services because there's this added service that they have to provide. And so I'm not going to go over any more of that, but if anybody does have any questions on that, feel free to put them in the chat and we can try to cover them. I know that many of these travel restrictions are not new, and although the standard for national interest exceptions have evolved quite a bit over the last year, once the Biden administration sort of normalized them across each country, they have remained relatively the same with the exception of the recent expansion of the validity period. Any NIE granted by a consular officer abroad is now valid for 12 months instead of for the original 30 days, which is incredibly helpful for anybody who is seeking to travel to the United States and might have multiple travel trips to one of the restricted countries. So next I want to talk about just a brief overview of State Department before I get into how COVID has really impacted the department. As Allison mentioned earlier, I was recently in the visa office and I just joined Variable and Leiden last month. So I'm pretty new to the ground here, but that means I just came out of the visa office where they are dealing with the COVID restrictions and the consular processing still. And so just a brief history and overview of the department, because I know that the department can be very confusing to those who are not familiar with how our embassies and consulates work abroad. There were over 270 embassies, consulates, and diplomatic missions. About 230 of those process visas. So that's a lot of sections to keep up with here domestically. And what that means is that all of them are probably going to handle things a little bit differently based on, their size, their staff, how their country operates. All of these consular sections are under the authority of the Bureau of Consular Affairs. So every embassy and consulate is under the authority of the Secretary of State, the head of the Department of State. And then within that authority, the Bureau of Consular Affairs is what supports the consular sections abroad. And these are the sections that provide services to American citizens and all of our visa services. Biden nominated Ambassador Rena Bitter to serve as the Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs earlier this year, and she had her hearing last month. If she's confirmed, she'll be the 7th ever career Foreign Service officer to lead the Bureau, which is actually pretty significant since there's been so few, especially recently. And then just to give you a sense about what some of our consular sections abroad look like, how they operate, in my role in the visa office and having been served and trained as a consular officer abroad, I have visited many of our consular sections and worked with our consular officers all around the world. And every consular section is a little different. They're all different as far as staffing goes. Some of them might have 1 or 2 officers working on consular services. Others may have 20, 30, maybe even 40 officers dedicated to consular services. This typically aligns with how much demand for services there is in a given country, taking into consideration availability of staff and resources that the department has. But this doesn't take into account the national interest exemption workload that I discussed previously. And this is pretty significant because it is a brand new workload. And it's something that the consular officers are having to do on top of all of their other work. So on top of providing American citizen services, on top of adjudicating immigrant visa and non-immigrant visa applications, they're also having to review whether an individual qualifies for a national interest exception. And they're having to do that not only with the visa applications that are coming into them, but also for those with valid visas and for those traveling on ESTA. So they have this whole new workload that they're trying to deal with at a time when they're already working with reduced capacity and with reduced in-office presence given the pandemic. Services may also vary seasonally and post by post. For example, some services for certain visa categories may be limited to the embassy or one of the consulates in a given country. Every summer, there's usually an influx of student visa applications, so things can change throughout the year or within a country. And then another thing is that the spacing varies, and this I will talk about a little bit more later. And then one thing to know is that Foreign Service officers typically serve 2-year tours. And what this means is that a consular officer will go into a tour, say in New Delhi, and they will serve there for 2 years. And then the next 2 years, they will pack up and head to their next tour in London or wherever they're going. Typically, they rotate every summer, which means this that you have about half of your staff in an embassy or consulate rotating out and on to their next assignment. This can, of course, create some gaps in staffing and can mean that there are some people out of the office while they're transitioning from one post to another post. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about how COVID is really impacting visa services and consular services abroad now that you have a little bit of an overview of what the consular operations might look like abroad and how they vary. So first I want to look at some numbers. So we pulled the non-immigrant visa workloads. This is just your non-immigrant visas, your H's, your L's, your B's for the last 5 years. And I think that this really exemplifies just how much the pandemic is really impacting visa services. If you look at the number for 2020 on the far right-hand side of your screen in comparison to 2019, you're looking at about a 7 million difference in the number of applications that were adjudicated in the fiscal year. And you can see how low that number is in comparison with prior years. And this is only for your non-immigrant visas, and that's the travel that is largely restricted under COVID. There's also a number of backlogs on the non-immigrant side, on the immigrant visa side, as well as just in processing national interest exceptions. So if we look at some other numbers for immigrant visas, this will give you, Kelly, can you change the slide, please? Thank you. If you look at the number for immigrant visas, this also gives you a sense of how much the pandemic has impacted the services. As of last month, there were over 500,000 immigrant visa applicants waiting for an interview. Only 6% of those applicants were scheduled for an interview in July, which is that little chart you can see on the right-hand side. To give you a sense of what that number looks like, that is about 34,000 applications in July in comparison to an monthly average of about 61,000 in fiscal year 2019. So they're only getting in about half of the applications right now, and the processing has actually increased over the summer in comparison to prior months. And so this is actually, the fact that they're getting about 50% is better than they were doing just a few months ago. So looking at these numbers and considering the travel restrictions, many people are wondering what is really impacting them. We recognize that there's COVID there, but a lot of people are being vaccinated, other countries are opening up. So what is it that is impacting consular services? There are really 4 things. Kelly, can you go to the next slide? there are really 4 things that are impacting consular services. I've put them in sort of 4 buckets for you here. The first is the Diplomacy Strong framework. This is the State Department's framework for reopening up and bringing people back to the office. It's a phased approach, and within each phase, there are restrictions on the number of personnel that can be in the office. And these restrictions apply to like the embassy as a whole or the consulate as a whole, not just the consular section. So, for example, in phase 1, only up to 40% of people can be at the embassy or consulate, and most posts are in phase 1. So this is a really big limitation on processing any of the visa services that they're providing. There are a number of factors that go into the Diplomacy Strong framework, such as COVID case count, medical infrastructure, travel restrictions, whether business is deemed essential or not, number of persons allowed in any given area, similar factors. And in order to move to a different phase under this framework, the embassy has to review all of these various factors and then seek approval from the highest levels at the State Department to move up. And as I mentioned, most posts are only in phase 1. And so that means that they only have 40%, if that many people at the embassy or consulate, and very few posts, if any, are in the 3rd and final phase at phase 3, which has the least amount of limitations within this framework. And so this is one thing that is really impacting operations. Another thing that is impacting consular operations is the visa prioritization guidance. And this prioritization guidance was put in place to assist with backlogs. We've talked about the backlogs. They're significant and they continue to grow given the limited services that state is providing. And as many of you know, State Department shut down visa services worldwide March 2020 for about 3 or 4 months. And whenever it reopened up, it put in place this visa prioritization guidance. And the visa prioritization guidance is separate from the Diplomacy Strong framework, but in many ways they work very closely together. The visa prioritization guidance is a tiered approach, and it takes into account some legal factors as well as policy considerations. One very important policy consideration for the Biden administration is family reunification. And so families are being prioritized. What this means for workers is that they are essentially taking a back seat. They are at the lowest tier for both immigrant and non-immigrant visa processing. And what this means for anybody seeking to travel for business is that if you're in an area trying to apply for a visa at a post that's not providing very many services because they're in phase 1 of the Diplomacy Strong framework and only can have 40% of their staff there, they're not going to be providing many services in the employment-based categories, if any at all. And so that's where these kind of play onto each other depending on where posts are and what their operations look like. Some posts are going to have more ability to provide services for the employment-based categories, while others may not. And then another thing is just operational challenges. And this is sort of a big bucket, but I'll briefly cover a few of the operational challenges that come up and that State Department has been dealing with. One I mentioned earlier, which is consular spacing. Consular spacing varies from each embassy and consulate. Some of them will have one wait room for all of their services. So for their American citizen services, as well as all of their visa services, whereas others may have 2 or 3 waiting rooms for each of the main services that they provide. The waiting rooms also vary in size. Some of them are tiny. They can be as tiny as your dentist office waiting room with just a few chairs, which obviously is not ideal for social distancing. Others might be as big as a friend's living room, and some will be even larger. But for those that have the limited spacing. And for those that have only one waiting room for all of the services they provide, that means that they have to take into account what American citizen services that they're providing and how they can socially distance applicants and get them through the waiting room. Pre-pandemic times, if you go to some of the larger posts, there are easily 1,000 applicants waiting outside the embassy in line for a visa. And in a lot of countries, that's not allowed right now. So they have to significantly reduce the number of people that are coming to the embassy and waiting in line because they have such limited space inside in the waiting room once they reach that point. Another operational challenge is the open workspace. So the consular sections on the side that the consular officers are working in are all open sections. And there are very few walls, if any. And so while these have some benefits for social distancing requirements and bringing multiple people to the office, they're not ideal. But that is a big fraud concern for State Department that so they want to ensure that managers have a line of sight into all operations that are going on in the consular section. And that's not something that they can easily fix, for a short time just during the pandemic. So that's another operational consideration that they are dealing with. Another challenge is that the visa work must be done in the office. All of the consular applications are installed only on department-owned computers that are in controlled access areas. They're not installed in personal computers. They're not even really installed on any laptops, though the department doesn't regularly issue laptops to its employees. So this limits what consular officers can do from home when they're not in the office. They might have some access to certain information through a department system, but they can't access the actual database where they process the visas unless they're in the office. And finally, I'll just briefly mention operational challenge that involves litigation and court orders. And the litigation and court orders that require the State Department issue certain visas or prioritize certain cases has impacts on their operations and on even their policies and priorities based on what that litigation says. And I won't get into any of that any further because I had to be on the other side of that for the last few years. It still stings a bit, so I'll leave that one there. But even if State Department got all of this right, even if they had the diplomacy strong framework worked out perfectly, their visa prioritization guidance was perfect, and they found a way to deal with all these operational challenges, there's still local conditions and restrictions at play. And these local conditions and restrictions vary by country and even within a given country. And they impact operations because they impact how many people can be in the embassy or how many people can be waiting outside the embassy. They impact some of the services that the consular sections rely on, such as passport delivery services. They might impact the ability of applicants to get medical exams or other documents that might be required from the local government or doctors. There's a number of ways that the local conditions and restrictions can impact their services, and those are outside of the US's control. Those are entirely put in place by the foreign countries or the local municipalities. Okay, so those are some of the things that are restricting consular operations. So just a few key takeaways before we move on to the next portion is basically that the bans are likely to remain until the trend changes. And even when these restrictions are lifted, the consulates are so backlogged that there are still going to be delays. So definitely plan for workarounds, plan for some time to seek out the national interest exception so long as the COVID bans are in place, possibly third country processing, or even taking a cooling off period in another country. And just keep in mind that visa appointment availability and processing times are going to vary by country. So you're going to need to check with the embassy or consulate for the most updated information. And BAL is always keeping track of what is going on, what the latest updates are, and are ready to report on any of those as they come out. And hopefully one day these COVID bans will be gone and we don't have to deal with the national interest exception, and we'll just be working through the backlogs and the delays associated with that.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the delays associated with visa processing and in particular the visa bulletin. So when we're planning for green card processing, there are a lot of terms thrown around like adjustment of status, which is also AOS, priority date, preference category, visa backlog, and these all have to do with the visa bulletin that comes out every month to identify what applicants are eligible for final processing. And these are applicants who, most of whom have been working and waiting for this change to go through final processing for permanent residents. So they've been working towards this, and therefore they are really often tracking it. And so they're waiting for that visa bulletin to come out. So you may have employees or clients coming to you pushing to be ready for the surge in October of this year, because many who are in the permanent residence process and are applying or waiting for their green cards are following the visa news and they're following that visa bulletin. And so we're going to talk about what's coming for this year in a few minutes, but it's important to recognize that last year the preference categories advanced significantly and caused some extreme backlogs in USCIS processing. And for this year, we do expect advancement, but we don't believe it's going to be as drastic as last year because there's still a lot of work to be done from the filings from last year. And ultimately, it will depend on how many immigrant visas and adjustment of status applications are issued and closed out by the end of the fiscal year. So we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to kind of talk us through, because for many, it's a really confusing process, the whole concept of the visa bulletin and how the visa numbers are allocated. And this is all, again, this is part of the permanent residence process or immigrant visa processing. An employee eligible for employment-based immigrant visa category first must have what we call a visa number in order to file the application, either the immigrant visa application at the consulate or the adjustment of status application here in the United States to actually get permanent residence. So the visa number has to be available to them, and that's what's published in the visa bulletin is the visa numbers based on priority date, and that priority date has to do with when their case was filed. So the Immigration and Nationality Act sets worldwide fiscal year limits on the number of immigrant visas that can be allocated every year. So the number of green cards that can be issued every year. And this happens, and it's broken into employment-based and family-based categories. And so each category has a specific number allocated each year. In employment-based cases, the number of immigrant visas available is 140,000 each fiscal year. And the fiscal year goes from October 1st to September 30th. And this is why you'll hear people getting really anxious about the October visa bulletin, because normally we do see some shifts and some changes when that fiscal year begins in October. Additionally, the 140,000 visa numbers that are allocated to the employment-based grouping is broken into 5 separate preference categories. So it goes EB 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first 3, which are most of our visa workers in the US, the first three, EB1, EB2, EB3, get about 40,000 visa numbers each. There's an additional wrinkle in that if those applicants have family members applying with them, the numbers include those family members. So that's, and further, it's broken into per country caps. So there are certain countries where you'll have more applicants than in other countries. So here, this graphic, we've got India and China, and that here you can see the how the wait times have moved over the last year for nationals of India and China, but they still have a significant wait time. So, 4 or 5 years for China, over 10 years for some nationals of India. And that means from the time their green card application, the first few steps of it, and actually the immigrant petition, when that was filed, establishes the priority date. So, so that's why, there's just so much anticipation. There's a lot of anxiety. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the processing issues that were experienced, there have been some enormous delays. So, we all know folks whose cases have been pending since October and very little action has been taken. Whereas in previous years, we would see movement. If there were a visa number that was current, we would see movement in processing. And so, right now, we're just waiting to see what USCIS can do and how much processing can get done by September 30th, which is the end of this fiscal year. And I think, Kelly, you're going to talk about what may be to come, what may happen. And so I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Sorry, my mute button's on the other side. So great, exactly. And so as Maggie was talking about, so what will happen is as those numbers roll over into the EB categories, as we saw this past October, then there's only a limited amount of time by which those numbers can be used within the fiscal year. So if they are not utilized by USCIS through the adjustment of status process, then those EB numbers don't then roll over into the new fiscal year. If they're not utilized, then they're lost. So it's kind of interesting because if the family-based ones are not used, they roll into EB. But if the EB ones are not used, then they are just lost. So that's where we have sort of this emergency and this crisis coming up. So in the near term, we do know that USCIS is taking actions behind the scenes to maximize the number of green cards it can issue before the end of this fiscal year, which is September 30th. So the clock is certainly ticking. But, so some of the things that they're looking at or that we're hearing that they're going to be doing is waiving those interview requirements. So we've been hearing this for a while, but we are starting to see that be kind of more prevalent in that they're not requiring those that have EB adjustment of status cases to be subject to that interview requirement policy. Remember, it's not a policy or it's not a law, it's not a requirement necessarily that it's a discretionary determination that USCIS can use. Under the Trump administration, they mandated that everybody in the EB adjustment status category be interviewed. That policy has not been lifted, but USCIS is going back to utilizing their discretionary authority to say, hey, in a lot of these cases, we don't need to issue an interview notice, and therefore they can just adjudicate the case based on paper. And so there's a lot of proactive outreach right now by the agency to get any documents that might be missing, like medicals or supplement J's, So many of you on the call, if you have folks that your companies are petitioning, you may be receiving phone calls from USCIS asking for those medicals or receiving RFEs saying, hey, submit those medicals. And this is all that push so that they can try to adjudicate as many cases as possible before the end of this fiscal year. Now, the other important thing to understand is even though those visa numbers are lost for ones that go unused, October 1st starts a new year and a new set of visa numbers. So, we do anticipate, as Maggie said, some more rollover again for this coming fiscal year, because again, as Tiffany was talking about, consular operations abroad have been severely hampered still this year. And so while those rollover numbers will come in fiscal year 2022, we're hearing from the State Department that it may not be as aggressive of an increase in movement as we saw last year. But the most important thing about it is folks that you have that maybe filed their applications last October, they're not going to lose their spot in line. There will be numbers, again, starting October 1st, that USCIS can then put them in. The shame, though, is just the general loss of those numbers. So key thing is they won't lose their line, their place in line. USCIS will still adjudicate their adjustment of status cases. The shame, though, is we shouldn't be letting visa numbers go to waste, understanding there are such huge backlogs in these categories, and the government should be utilizing every single visa number that it can. So, so again, that question then is, so what would happen potentially for those unused numbers on September 30th? So a few of those possibilities could be congressional action. So there are discussions ongoing to potentially include provisions in budget reconciliation or another piece of must-pass legislation to preserve those unused visa numbers in their current categories. And that would roll over now into this next fiscal year. So that would mean, say, if there are those 100,000 unused employment-based green cards on September 30th, those 100,000 unused numbers would then be added to the employment-based cap for FY 2022. And then they would just remain available. So, but on that flip side, family-based numbers would not spill over to the employment-based, and then we instead remain available for issuance in those family-based categories in FY 2022. So, there's lots of discussions going on about this, and whether or not, maybe the infrastructure bill might be an avenue by which they add this. So certainly we're following that and more to come. Then whether or not agency action can be taken place. So we are hearing that there are legal arguments being circulated within the Department of Homeland Security, and that's encouraging the government to change the way it interprets visa issuance. So essentially assigning or allocating an immigrant visa number earlier in the adjudication process so that the numbers can be allocated within that current fiscal year. So for example, when USCIS adjudicates the application, they generally don't consider that visa number being utilized until they actually approve the case. As opposed to they could potentially allocate that visa number for any of these pending cases, and only if the case is denied, then that visa number would then go unused. And so that's another avenue that's being looked at. But these, we're not really sure the appetite within the agency to do that, because the way that the regulation is written can be pretty strict. And so it may be a little difficult for the agency to sort of change that, the way that issue visa issuance happens. But again, we're following that, and more to come if we hear anything else. Then finally, we are aware that there's really no action that might be taken place, and then that could lead to what we are now aware of is litigation. So most recently, there is a case that was filed on August 2nd by a group of applicants, and they're asking the court to order USCIS to process their applications by the end of this fiscal year, or in the alternative, preserve their visa numbers through next year. So it's really too early to predict the outcome of that. But in the past, the courts have generally been pretty reluctant to grant relief outside of the context of the diversity visa, because the diversity visa program runs a little bit differently than the way these employment visa cases are issued. So in a diversity visa, we most recently saw a court issue an order requiring the Department of State to reserve, I believe it was 9,000 or so visa numbers. But the reason why the court felt compelled to do that is in the diversity visa lottery, if those visas go unused and are not issued to people who are eligible to it for them in that fiscal year, they're lost forever, and those folks no longer are eligible for a diversity visa. So they would have to reapply all over again. That's not the case in the employment base, right? So as we were saying, they'll still keep their space in line. It just won't be as quickly as we were all hoping it would be. So again, so we're not exactly sure how sympathetic the courts will be, but certainly more to come on that. So if no action is taken to preserve the numbers and unused family-based numbers, then again would roll over into this next fiscal year, which begins October 1st. And then as we previously said, we're hearing that numbers will not advance as quickly on this outset, but certainly throughout the year, we're going to continue to monitor it, because we know that there are going to be some significant numbers that do roll over, and we'll see whether or not the Department of State may look at those priority dates and increase them gradually throughout the year, as opposed to the large increase that we saw last October, and then there weren't as significant increases throughout the rest of the year. So certainly more to come on all of this as all of this unfolds at the end of the fiscal year. Okay, so our takeaways. So Maggie, I will turn it back over to you to talk about some of the key takeaways.
Thanks, Kelly. I mean, it really is, there's never a dull moment. And I think that, and to use another cliche, the best defense is a good offense. And really here, considering filing strategies and budgeting. I think that was a big takeaway that we learned last fall, was that businesses should be prepared for this, and so should applicants. That the filings are, a significant amount of money for individuals to pay on their own if that's what they're doing, and certainly if a business is covering for its employees, it can be a huge expense towards the end of the year. So planning from a budget perspective is important to know who may be eligible, or whose priority date is coming up for filing, given the history of the visa bulletin. And then also, given the USCIS processing timelines and the backlogs and the delays that we've seen, it's also important to plan for non-immigrant work coverage. So if we've got people working and you were possibly counting on their green card case and the work authorization that comes through that to be issued, so that you didn't have to renew a non-immigrant visa status, definitely want to consider keeping that non-immigrant visa status going while this case is being filed, because the processing delays have been extreme. And then, really, like Tiffany and I started on the same day, just a month ago. And so I'm very new to BAL. I've really been blown away by the technology used to track these cases and to track the applicants and who may be coming, and so really getting prepared, learning what we learned last year. I never want to go through that again, using a system where I'm not prepared, where I don't have the wherewithal or the resources to pull reports at my fingertips, because oftentimes there's a very specific timeline during which you have to get everything pulled, prepared, checked, filed, and receipted in order for the case to be considered valid and accepted for processing. And so the timeline is not a long timeline. And so it's really important to have the resources available to be able to run the reports, to keep your clients or your employees involved and aware of what will be needed down the line. So all of this tracking is, crucial to case processing. Also training, learning what we learned over the last year in terms of the applications and the changes. That's one thing that I think, like I said, there's never a dull moment. There's always something changing. There's always a form changing. And so being able to keep on top of that is really crucial, because it can mean, it could be the difference between having your case accepted and processed, or at least in that queue, or having your case rejected because you didn't check a box properly. And we did see that happen in some cases where people are now having to address those issues. So
Maggie, sorry. Since we're on that topic real quick, there's been a couple of these that have come in through the chat. And I think while we're on that subject of being prepared, do you think it would be advantageous if employers have folks that are waiting for their interviews or waiting for their adjustment of status cases to be adjudicated? Should they just go out and get their medicals done in anticipation that they may get an RFE or a call from a USCIS officer? Or what are your thoughts about advising folks, understanding that USCIS has this big push right now?
So my advice is, yes, if their case is pending, I would advise to go ahead and get those appointments and get the medical. In some areas, it's taking 1 to 2 months to get in for a medical exam. And USCIS has just announced that they will accept medicals. I think it's 4 years now? Does anybody know? It's at least, they'll be valid for at least 2 years. I thought it was 3 or 4. But they will accept that and they will remain valid. So it used to be that if someone got a medical, that medical exam was only valid for 1 year. And so USCIS has now extended that to accept the medicals and keep them on file for longer. And so yes, I would recommend advising applicants who currently have cases on file to obtain a medical exam, and also for cases that are being filed upcoming. So if they anticipate, if they're very close to their priority date being current on the current visa bulletin, I would say it's advantageous for them to go ahead and get a medical exam appointment so that they can file their application with that medical exam.
Great, thanks. And we do have another question coming in. Tiffany, I'm not sure if you might be able to address this based upon what you're hearing on the ground, but it's a great question. Is due to the Afghan refugee situation, do you think that might impact processing times? Are you hearing anything from the consulate side in terms of, are they pulling folks from various consulates to assist, and then that might increase wait times for visas?
So it's hard to say how much it will impact employment base directly. I do think that it could have some impacts overall on visa services. And I know that the State Department has been pulling all of their resources. Every foreign service officer at the State Department has at some point in time been trained as a consular officer, because they are required to do a consular tour as either their first or second tour. So the entire State Department is basically filled with consular officers. Some of them just haven't done consular work in a very long time. So I know that they are pulling from some of that experience from within the department to send people out to third countries to process, to build up their operations here domestically. And I assume that some of the embassy staff and some of the consulate staff abroad are also being pulled to help with that matter. I think that it's probably going to have a little bit more of an impact on non-immigrant services that are being provided than immigrant services, but it's hard to say how they're going to prioritize that in comparison to how they're already prioritizing visas.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, and in terms of the USCIS, you know, for those of you who are unaware of sort of the difference, so as Maggie was saying, you know, there is the immigrant visa process, and then there is the adjustment of status-based process. The immigrant visa process handled by State Department generally focuses mostly on family-based. It's not to say that, you know, there's not, you know, there certainly are EB or employment-based cases that come through the immigrant visa process, but generally statistics have shown that most of the employment-based visa cases are adjudicated through USCIS. I believe it's the last statistic I saw was 85% of those cases. So I don't know then that, you know, because while USCIS is also offering up civilian staff to go and assist on the crisis, it is a different department. They do have a refugee corps and asylum corps that are well trained in a lot of the issues that are being dealt with in terms of the humanitarian crisis for Afghanistan. So again, not sure that that adjustment of status processing will be affected greatly, but you know, obviously certainly more to come depending upon how things unfold in Afghanistan as well. So great question. So I think we've got time probably for like one more question. Let me see, I'm just looking through the chat. Sorry, we've been trying.
There's one related as a follow-up on Afghanistan that I can touch on, relating to obtaining police clearances if they've been employed in Afghanistan within the past 5 years. I think that this is going to be a perfect example of an unobtainable document. And that is in the State Department regulations that if a document is unobtainable, the individual applying for the visa can just, you know, say an argument. I think here is there's not much that you need to say other than what is going on right now. And if the consular officer is convinced that that document is unobtainable, then they don't have to require that document.
Great. And same with I know there was a question in the chat as well about immigrant visa processing for EB cases, and generally you know, we are seeing longer wait times, as Tiffany was saying, and that, you know, the priority is certainly on adjudicating cases that are for US citizens, for lawful permanent residents, and then the employment-based cases. So certainly long wait times there on those immigrant visa processing cases on that side. So, you know, certainly more to come as, you know, State Department's able to increase staff and COVID restrictions become less needed with more vaccinations and numbers going down. But certainly long wait times in those categories for sure. Okay. So I think
one more.
Yeah, one more. Is there? Sorry, well, we're just trying.
Oh.
I see one here. It's asked.
Thanks.
Trying to pull. You guys are sending more. Was approved for a national interest exemption, but they now have to get a new passport. Will that national interest exemption?
Oh, okay. So I think it was the last question there, Maggie. Do you see that last one?
Yeah, about the medical. I was just typing out an answer.
For national with a new passport. I think that might have been the one she was asking. I think we just lost her. Okay, well then, no. All right, then, well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So sorry about the little technical glitch there. But I'm going to go ahead and pass along these questions to BAL so that hopefully they can answer them offline. They've answered a ton of them, so thank you so much for doing that. And thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And I'd also like to send a very special thank you to BAL for their sponsorship of this webinar. A quick reminder that you will be receiving an email tomorrow with a link to the course evaluation and to the page where you can access the handout and recording of this session. So you will be able to access that. Again, any questions, if you want to submit them now, I will be passing them along to Kelly, Tiffany, and Maggie. So thank you all again. Have a great day, and you may now disconnect.